They called her devil-touched. They said her eyes were wrong too, still too old, too much like something that had been watching the world from a great distance for a very long time. They said a child who knew rain was coming before the clouds arrived was not a natural child. They said the things she knew were not the kind of things a girl was supposed to know, and the things she said were not the kinds of things anyone wanted to hear. On the morning of September 29, 1886, the people of Harrowfield, Montana Territory drove an 11-year-old girl into the wilderness with nothing but a wool blanket, a small sack of cornmeal, and a hunting knife that a 14-year-old boy had pressed into her hand when no one was watching. 6 months later, those same people would crawl through waist-deep snow to find her. But that comes later. First, there was the morning. The air over Harrowfield that September carried a smell that the oldest residents recognized, and the youngest could not name, not snow, not yet, but the smell of earth preparing to lock itself shut. Pine sap running thick and slow. Grass frost stiffened and refusing to yield, even after the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The smell of a world pulling inward, bracing the way an old man draws his coat tight before he even feels the wind coming. Harrowfield sat in a valley between hills covered with lodgepole pine, 3 days' ride from the nearest railroad. 140 souls lived there, ranchers, mostly a few merchants, a preacher, a doctor, a blacksmith, a general store that smelled of coffee and leather and dry goods stored too long. Enough people to know each other's names. Not enough to truly know each other. That was the way of frontier towns, close in distance, strangers in the heart. The town survived on cattle. Cattle was money. Money was safety. And safety was the only thing people truly worshipped out there, no matter what they said in church on Sundays. When the herds were fat, Harrowfield prospered. When the herds suffered, Harrowfield suffered with them. And on that cold September morning, a girl named Ada Crane stood at the edge of this town, about to be cast into the wilderness, because she had dared to say that the cattle would die. Ada Crane was small for 11. With dark hair her father had always kept trim clear of her eyes because in the mountains he said your line of sight it is your life. Her eyes were gray, not the pale gray of sky before rain, but the deep gray of wet slate, the color of things older than the face that held them. Those eyes had always unsettled the adults of Harrowfield, not because they were hostile, not because they challenged, but because they were still. They watched the world the way a hawk watches from a thermal patient, measuring, expecting nothing. That quality in a child was not considered natural. Over her thin shoulders lay a wool blanket old and frayed at the edges, washed every spring in Cold Creek water, and dried on warm stones, and folded with the kind of careful attention that most people reserve for things they cannot replace. The blanket had belonged to her mother. Margaret Crane had died bringing Ada into the world, and the blanket still held a faint trace of lavender. The ghost of a woman Ada had never met, preserved in wool fiber, carried everywhere the girl went, because it was the only thing of her mother's that the world had not taken. In her hand, a small sack of cornmeal, enough for a week if she was careful. That was everything. That was all 140 people thought necessary for a child they were sending to die. To understand Ada Crane, you have to understand Thomas Crane first. Thomas was a trapper and a hunter, but calling him that was like calling a river wet. True, but insufficient. Thomas Crane belonged to the mountains the way few men ever belong to anything in this life. He did not simply live in the high country. He read it. He listened to it. He understood the language it spoke through wind and snowfall and the particular way light fell across a hillside at 4 in the afternoon in October. His grandfather had come from the Scottish Highlands carrying in his blood the cold of Northern Europe, and in his memory the stories of winters that could erase a village in a single night. That knowledge had passed from grandfather to father to son, never written in any book, never taught in any school, transmitted only by voice and hand in places where one mistake meant one death. Thomas had no son. He had Ada. And so he gave everything to Ada the same way his grandfather had given it to his father, without reservation, without modification, without the quiet, cultural hesitation that told men their daughters did not need to know such things. Thomas Crane simply did not believe that. In his experience, the mountains did not care whether you were a boy or a girl. The cold did not negotiate. The snow did not make exceptions. You either knew enough to survive or you did not, and the mountains settled the question with a finality that no human argument could appeal. There was a night Ada remembered more clearly than any other. She was 8 years old. The two of them sat beside a fire in the high country after a long day checking trap lines. Thomas was warming his hands over the flames. Big hands, calloused fingers, slightly curved from years of pulling trap wire in the cold. He pointed at a woolly bear caterpillar making its slow way across a log near the fire pit. "What do you see?" Ada looked. "A woolly bear. Orange band is very narrow, almost all black." Thomas nodded, the slow, deliberate nod he saved for when Ada saw the right thing. "What does a narrow orange band mean?" "Long winter, cold winter." "That is right," he said. "But not enough. One caterpillar can be wrong. 10 caterpillars saying the same thing are never wrong." "How many did you count today?" "7. All nearly black." He nodded again. "Now look up. Which way are the geese flying south?" "But it is only September." "That is right. Only September. And they are already gone 3 weeks earlier than last year." "And did you see the beaver dam on Miller Creek yesterday? Higher than normal." "Much higher." He stared into the fire for a long time before he spoke again. When the words came, they came slowly, and Ada understood, without being told, that these were the kind of words a person carries for the rest of their life. "Nature never lies," he said. "Only people lie. And when people refuse to listen, nature teaches them the hard way, the expensive way, the way that fills graveyards." He paused, then added quieter, "But remember this, knowing the truth and speaking the truth are two different things. People do not like hearing what they do not want to believe, and they punish the messenger harder than they ever punish the message." Ada asked, "So we stay silent?" Thomas looked at his daughter across the fire for a long time. The stars above were so bright and so close that a child could believe the sky itself was listening. "You always speak," he said, "because staying silent when you know the truth is just another way of lying. But after you speak, you prepare because most of the time they will not listen." He taught her to read the world the way other fathers taught their children to read books. He showed her that beaver dams built higher than normal predicted deeper snow, that every additional foot of dam height corresponded roughly to an additional foot of snowfall. The beavers had been building for 1,000 generations. Their instincts were older and wiser than any almanac printed by human hands. He taught her to watch the elk. When the herds came down from the high country a month ahead of schedule, coats already thick as December, though it was barely October, eyes carrying an anxiety that had no specific predator as its source, that was not random behavior. That was an entire species speaking through movement, because they had no words saying the same thing the beavers were saying, the same thing the caterpillars were saying, the same thing every caching squirrel in the territory was saying, with its frantic, desperate urgency. He taught her about stone, about thermal mass, about the way sandstone absorbs heat from a fire and releases it slowly through the night, the way a hearth remembers a flame long after the flame itself is gone. He told her about the ancient peoples who had carved their homes into cliff faces and used this principle to survive winters that would have killed anyone living in a structure made of wood. "Stone remembers warmth," Thomas said, "the way soil remembers rain, the way bone remembers cold. Everything in nature remembers. Only people forget." He taught her to trap rabbits, to read roots, to cure hides, to manage fire for different purposes. A cooking fire, a warming fire, a fire built against wolves circling in the dark. He taught her that fire was the oldest human tool, older than the knife, older than the spear, and that the person who lost fire in winter was already dead. They just had not stopped walking yet. By 7, Ada could predict weather 3 days in advance. By 9, she could read an approaching storm in the behavior of birds and the quality of light on distant peaks. She had become, in her father's quiet estimation, a true child of the mountains. Then the mountains took Thomas away. It happened in the summer of 1884 in a canyon above the Bitterroot River where grizzlies came to fish. Thomas went to check his trap lines alone. He told Ada to stay at base camp, keep the fire burning, secure the food. "I will be back before dark." Those were his last words to his daughter. He did not come back that night. Ada was not immediately frightened. Her father sometimes stayed out overnight when he found good sign worth following. She cooked beans, fed the fire, wrapped herself in her mother's blanket, and listened to the owls calling across the canyon. Everything was normal, impossibly cruelly normal. Later, whenever Ada remembered that first night, she hated its normality, hated how she had not known that the world had already changed completely while she lay listening to owls waiting for a dawn that would bring nothing but loss. On the fourth morning, she followed the ravens. Ravens always know where meat is. They led her to a clearing where the grass was stained dark brownish red, and the air carried a smell Ada recognized: copper and sweetness. The smell of butchering deer, but magnified, concentrated, turned from something ordinary into something that stopped her feet at the edge of the clearing. Thomas Crane lay face down near a fallen log. His rifle was unfired. His hunting knife was still in its sheath. Ada stood over her father's body and understood something that would take her years to fully articulate. The grizzly's tracks told the story clearly: a female traveling with a cub, surprised at close range. Thomas had seen the tracks. She could tell from the way he had approached, cautious and slow. He had chosen not to fire. He had seen a mother with her young, and he had made the choice that his own nature demanded of him. Thomas Crane had died because he could not bring himself to kill a mother protecting her cub. The man who had spent Ada's entire life teaching her compassion had been killed by the compassion that lived at his core. Ada stood in that clearing for a long time. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there, breathing, feeling something close inside her chest, the way a door swings shut on iron hinges, the part of her that still believed there was always someone larger and wiser to absorb the worst of what the world could do. That part died in the clearing alongside her father. Then she picked up his knife and began to dig. 2 days, rocky soil that fought her for every inch. Her hands blistered in the first hour, broke open in the second, bled through the third and fourth and fifth. There were moments when her hands had no strength left, and she had to use her boots and her weight to drive the blade into the earth because her arms had nothing left to give. But she did not stop. This was the last thing she could do for the man who had given her everything. When the grave was finished, when she had lowered her father into the earth as gently as a 9-year-old girl can lower a grown man, when she had covered the body with stones and piled more on top until the cairn was solid enough to last, Ada stood at the head of the grave as the sun went down behind the mountains. She spoke in a voice that did not shake, because shaking was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I will remember everything you taught me. I will survive, and I will make sure that what you knew does not die with you." Then she turned east and walked toward Harrowfield, the nearest settlement, hoping to find some kind of life among people. She was 9 years old. She was completely alone, and she carried inside her a weight of knowledge that would eventually get her cast out like a leper. Ada lived in Harrowfield for 2 years before they sent her away. No family formally took her in. She slept in the storage room behind Mrs. Agnes Vance's general store, a space roughly 8 feet by 6 feet that smelled of flour dust and the faintly sweet decay of produce that had not sold quickly enough. Mrs. Vance allowed the arrangement because the poor child needed somewhere to go, and because having a girl who swept floors and hauled boxes without complaint was the kind of Christian kindness that paid for itself. Ada swept and stacked and carried in exchange for a spot on a wooden floor and 2 meals a day. Nobody called it what it was. They called it charity. She did not fit in, not because she refused to try. She tried. In the first week, she attempted to join the other children at play, but she did not know their games, did not understand their jokes, could not follow the invisible rules that governed who was allowed to speak and who was supposed to listen. when laughter was genuine and when it was a weapon. She had grown up in a high country where silence was the primary language and actions were the only currency that mattered. In Harrowfield, everything operated in reverse. People talked endlessly and did little, smiled constantly, but the smiles often meant something other than happiness. Ada could read the weather in a caterpillar's coat. She could not read the weather in a human face. In a small frontier town, the second skill mattered far more than the first. The children called her strange. The adults called her troubled. The phrases circulated through Harrowfield like a low-grade fever, the wild girl, the trapper's daughter, that odd child in the storeroom. And gradually, Ada Crane became what every small community seems to require: the outsider, the one who is different, so that everyone else can point and quietly reassure themselves that at least they are not like her. There was one moment of grace in 2 years of quiet exile. One afternoon, Ada was sitting on the fence behind the general store watching the sky the way she watched everything with complete focused attention. The kind her father had taught her was the price of understanding. Ruth Hale, the preacher's wife, walked past on her way inside. She was a small woman with careful hands and careful eyes, married to a man whose voice filled every room he entered, but whose listening never quite matched his volume. She stopped, looked at the girl, then looked at the sky. "What do you see up there?" Ada answered without thinking. "High-altitude clouds moving against the surface wind. Heavy rain tomorrow before noon." Ruth studied her for a long moment. There was something in her expression that Ada had not seen from any adult in Harrowfield before. Not pity, not suspicion, something closer to recognition. "You are like your father," Ruth said softly. Then she walked inside. It was the only time in 2 years that anyone in Harrowfield mentioned Thomas Crane without using the word madman. Ada held that sentence for days, turned it over like a smooth stone, kept it in the same place she kept her mother's lavender and her father's voice. 3 days before the exile, Ada was stacking flour sacks in the back of Mrs. Vance's store, listening to the ordinary chatter of a Tuesday afternoon, absorbing information without appearing to pay attention. It was a skill she had developed out of necessity. In a place where she was unwanted, knowing what people were thinking was as important as knowing which berries were poisonous and which were food. She had not planned to speak. 2 years had taught her the cost of being noticed. But for 2 weeks, every sign in the natural world had been screaming at her, and the volume had finally exceeded her ability to stay silent. It had begun with the beaver dams on Miller Creek. Ada had walked the bank 3 times in a single week, measuring with the experienced eye her father had spent years calibrating. The dams were higher than any year she could recall, not merely taller but denser, built with a frantic urgency that went beyond normal autumn preparation. The beavers were not building for a hard winter. They were building for something that had no precedent in their recent memory. Then the elk. Moving down from the high country a full month ahead of schedule, in herds larger than Ada had ever seen, coats already thick as deep December, though the calendar still said September. Their eyes held a restlessness wired into their nervous systems by 100,000 years of evolution, an alarm responding to signals in the atmosphere that human senses had long since lost the ability to detect. The woolly bear caterpillars. Ada had counted 23 in a single week. Every one of them nearly solid black, the orange band reduced to a thread so thin it barely existed. Her father had taught her that one caterpillar was an anecdote, but 20 caterpillars were data, and the data was unanimous. And finally, the honeybees. The colony in the old cottonwood at the edge of town had sealed their hive with wax twice as thick as any previous year Ada had observed. When bees seal heavy, they are preparing for cold that penetrates to the marrow of the earth itself. Bees have been reading winter since before the first human being walked upright. They do not guess, they know. Each sign alone might be explained away by someone determined not to believe. But all of them together, every species in the valley, saying the same thing with the only language available to creatures without words, that was not coincidence. That was 40 million years of evolution, delivering a warning to anyone willing to hear it. And so Ada spoke. Her voice cut through the comfortable chatter of the store, and every head turned and every eye fixed on the strange, quiet girl from the storeroom who never quite fit and never quite disappeared. The winter is coming early. It will be the worst winter anyone here has ever seen. The snow will bury the rooftops. The cold will kill the cattle. If you do not prepare now, people will die. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ada had ever heard. Then it shattered. Mrs. Agnes Vance let out a sound that was half laugh and half theatrical gasp, shaking her head with the exaggerated sympathy she reserved for situations where she wanted to appear kind while actually being dismissive. "Poor child," she said. "Her mind has been unsettled since her father passed. All that time alone in the mountains, it is a wonder she can speak at all, doctor." Bernard Holt stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles with the self-importance of educated men in small towns who have come to believe their credentials exempt them from the obligation to learn anything new. He was 42 years old, trained at a college back east, and he had positioned himself as Harrowfield's sole authority on all matters scientific. "There is no scientific basis for such predictions," he announced, speaking in the slow, deliberate tone he used with patients and children, which in his mind were roughly the same category. "Weather is the province of instruments and observation, not the imaginings of an orphan girl. This is mountain superstition, and we would do well to dismiss it entirely." Fletcher Wade the blacksmith laughed outright. He was 35, broad-shouldered, quick with a joke, and quicker with cruelty. The kind of man who mistakes loudness for strength and mockery for wit. "Maybe we ought to start building her a headstone now," he said, and the laughter spread through the store like fire through dry grass. Ugly laughter. The laughter of people who are frightened and cannot admit it, who have been offered a truth they cannot accept, and so convert their fear into ridicule because ridicule is easier than courage. But not every face in that store laughed. Old Silas Drum, 72 years old and the oldest living soul in Harrowfield, watched Ada from across the room with an expression no one else present would have recognized because no one else present had lived through what Silas had lived through. It was the expression of a man watching history repeat itself, of a man who had been 12 years old in the winter of 1856, the only survivor of a family of 7, of a man who recognized in the still gray eyes of this girl the face he had worn that terrible year, the face of someone telling a truth that nobody wants to hear. Callum Briggs, 14 years old, and the son of one of the smaller ranchers in the district, stood near the door with his fists clenched at his sides. He could not have said why he believed the girl from the storeroom. He could not have articulated it if asked. But there was something in her voice, not fear, not madness, but a quiet certainty that felt like bedrock, like something that was simply true whether a person believed it or not. And Ruth Hale pressed her hand flat against her chest and turned toward the window, as though looking at the girl directly was causing her physical pain. She remembered the afternoon of the clouds. She remembered saying, "You're like your father." She knew in the place beneath the role of obedient wife and faithful congregation member that this child was telling the truth. But knowing and acting are two different things, and the space between them is where moral cowardice has always made its home. Then there was Gerald Voss. Gerald Voss was 48 years old, the owner of the largest ranch in the district, wealthy by the standards of a territory where most men measured their worth in cattle and land. He was accustomed to being listened to, accustomed to having his opinions treated as settled fact. When Ada finished speaking, Gerald Voss drew himself up to his full height and declared in the measured tone of a man who has confused duration of residence with depth of knowledge that he had lived in Montana Territory for 30 years, that no child could predict the future, and that this kind of hysteria was precisely the reason that certain people were not suited for civilized community. He said it loudly. He said it with complete conviction. And then Gerald Voss went home. What nobody in that store saw, and what would not come to light until many months later, was what Gerald Voss did when he arrived home that evening. He went directly to his cellar. He spent 3 hours taking careful inventory. And then quietly, methodically, over the following 2 weeks, he began adding to his private stores extra flour, extra salt pork, extra dried beans, enough to sustain his family through a winter of the severity Ada had described. Gerald Voss did not believe the girl was wrong. Gerald Voss believed the girl was right, and he acted on that belief in the only way that his fear and his pride would permit, privately, selfishly in secret, while publicly leading the charge to silence her. Because admitting that an 11-year-old girl from a storage room knew something he did not would have been more than his identity could survive. Because the price of cattle would fall if word spread that the winter might be catastrophic. Because Gerald Voss had built his entire sense of himself on being the man who knew things, and the thought of being instructed by a child he had dismissed was something his soul could not accommodate. He would carry the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. By evening, Reverend Solomon Hale had called a meeting in the church. Solomon Hale was 55 years old with a voice like a summer storm and eyes like flint that had been struck until all the softness was gone. He had led Harrowfield's congregation for 20 years, and over those 2 decades, something had happened to him that happens to many men who hold unchallenged authority for too long. He had begun as a man of genuine faith, a young preacher who believed in mercy and humility and the simple practice of helping others. But 20 years of never being questioned, 20 years of watching his congregation nod at everything he said, 20 years of hearing his own voice echo off church walls and mistaking that echo for the voice of God, and all of it had transformed faith into something harder and more dangerous. Certainty, the absolute unshakable conviction that he was right, that his judgment was divine judgment, that anyone who disagreed with him was disagreeing with the Almighty himself. He was not a monster. He was something more difficult than that. He was a good man who had lost the ability to tell the difference between his own will and God's. And that confusion, sustained over decades and never challenged, had calcified into something that no amount of evidence could penetrate. The church interior flickered with oil lamp light. 47 adults filled the wooden pews. The meeting was not a trial. It was a sentencing that dressed itself as a trial, and everyone in the room understood this, except perhaps the man conducting it, who had convinced himself completely that what was happening is justice. Ada stood alone before the altar, small and thin and utterly still. She did not fidget. She did not look at the floor. Those gray eyes moved from face to face with the quiet attention of someone cataloging information. The expressions, the positions, the tells of people who had made up their minds before they sat down. No natural child knows such things, Reverend Hale thundered. No godly child. This is the work of darkness. This girl speaks with the voice of the deceiver, spreading fear to serve purposes that no righteous congregation should permit. She is either touched by evil or simply dangerous. And in either case, she must be removed before her influence spreads to our families, our children, our community. The vote was 47 in favor of exile, 3 against old Silas Drum, Callum Briggs, and one woman seated near the back whose name was never recorded in any account of that evening. A woman who raised her hand against the current of 47 and was swallowed by history the way quiet courage so often is. Throughout the proceedings, Ada had not spoken a single word in her own defense, had not wept, had not begged, had not tried to reason with people who had no interest in reason. She simply stood before the altar of a church that was supposed to protect the innocent, and she watched each face that condemned her, and she remembered every one. When the verdict was announced, she spoke one sentence in a voice so calm it seemed to come from somewhere older than her body. "I will be waiting for you there." Nobody understood what she meant, but the way she said it made Solomon Hale hesitate for a single fraction of a second, a tiny falter in the iron of his certainty, before he waved his hand in dismissal. The morning of September 29, 1886 was cold and gray over Harrowfield. Ada stood at the edge of town with her mother's blanket on her shoulders, the sack of cornmeal in her hand, the patched clothes on her back. Behind her, people stood in doorways and on porches. Nobody spoke. Nobody waved. The silence had its own weight, heavier than any accusation, because accusations at least acknowledge that a person exists. This silence said that Ada Crane had already ceased to exist. She had been erased. She did not look back. Her father had taught her that. Looking back is for people who have somewhere to return to. But before she could take her first step, a hand caught her arm. Callum Briggs had come from the side, moving quickly, checking over his shoulder. He was 4 years older than Ada, tall for his age, with the calloused hands of a boy who had worked cattle since he could walk. He pressed something into her hand with an urgency that bordered on desperation. It was a hunting knife. 8-inch blade handle worn smooth by generations of use, honed sharp enough to shave with. It had belonged to his grandfather. "I do not believe them," Callum whispered. "You will survive. I know you will. And when you are proven right, I will find you." Then he was gone back into the crowd before anyone noticed what had passed between them. Ada slipped the knife into her belt and felt its weight against her hip like a promise made solid. Old Silas Drum stood at the very edge of the gathered crowd, leaning on his walking stick, his weathered face carefully neutral, in the way old men arrange their faces when they are feeling something too large to show. But his eyes were wet, and 72-year-old men in Montana Territory do not let their eyes get wet in public unless something inside them has broken past the point where pride can hold it. As Ada passed, he spoke quietly, words meant for her ears alone. "In 1856, the snow buried the church steeple. I was the only one in my family of 7 who survived. I was 12 years old." Ada stopped walking but did not turn around. "Go north," Silas continued. "There are sandstone cliffs where the hills meet the valley floor. Your father knew that country. You will know it too. And when they come looking, and they will come looking, remember that the choice to help them is always yours alone. The mountain will teach you to survive. Only you can decide what kind of person you want to be." He paused, then added one more thing quietly enough that only Ada could hear. "Gerald Voss has a private store in his cellar. He stocked it the night after you spoke in the store. He believes you. He just could not afford to say so. Remember that too." Ada nodded once, a small movement. The old man acknowledged it with the slightest inclination of his own head. An understanding passed between them that required no further words. The understanding of two people who have been where no one should ever have to go, who recognize in each other the particular loneliness of being right when the world insists you are wrong. Then the girl continued walking. The town of Harrowfield disappeared behind her. The road turned to trail. Trail turned to open country, and the open country stretched north toward hills that were already wearing the first thin dusting of snow along their upper ridges, pale against the gray sky, quiet and waiting. Ada Crane walked toward them with the wool blanket on her shoulders and the lavender ghost of her mother and the voice of her father and the weight of everything she knew burning in her chest like a coal that refused to go out. She was 11 years old. She did not look back. The walk north took 2 days. On the first day, Ada found grizzly tracks in the soft earth of the trail, fresh, large. The prints were sunk deep, each one wider than both of her hands, placed side by side, the claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the toe pads. A big bear, moving north through the same corridor of foothills she needed to follow. She stood on the trail and looked at those tracks for a long time. The fear that moved through her was not the social fear of Harrowfield, not the fear of being mocked or excluded or cast out. This was older than that. This was the primal physical fear of a creature that could end her life in seconds, the same kind of creature that had ended her father's life in a clearing above the Bitterroot River, while a 9-year-old girl sat at a campfire and listened to owls and did not know that her world had already changed forever. She made her decision without deliberation. She turned west off the trail and began picking her way through the undergrowth along the ridgeline, adding half a day to her journey, but putting a mile of rock and timber between herself and wherever the bear was heading. It was the cautious choice, the survival choice. Her father would have made the same one, But as she moved through the undergrowth, the weight of the decision settled on her shoulders alongside the blanket. This was the first true survival choice she had made with no one beside her. The first time she was entirely alone with a decision that carried real consequence. And the loneliness of that pressed down harder than the cornmeal sack, harder than anything physical. She was 11 years old. There was no one in the world to tell her if she was right. On the second day, the cliffs appeared. They rose from the sagebrush flats like the walls of something ancient and deliberate, 40 feet of red gold sandstone, layered and fractured by millions of years of wind and water glowing in the afternoon light as though heated from within. A small valley opened at their base, sheltered from the north wind by the cliff face itself, fed by a spring that emerged from a crack in the rock and fell in a thin, clear ribbon over a series of stone ledges before pooling and vanishing back into the earth. Ada stood at the edge of this valley and felt something shift inside her chest. Not peace, not yet, but recognition. Her father had described places like this, had spoken of sandstone cliffs where the rock was soft enough to carve but hard enough to last for centuries, had told her about springs that never froze because they came from deep within the earth where the temperature held constant, regardless of what the season above was doing, had described the ancient peoples who had carved homes into cliff faces and used the stone's memory of heat to survive winters that would have killed anyone living in wood. This was the place old Silas Drum had pointed her toward. This was the place her father had known. She studied the cliff face carefully, reading it the way Thomas had taught her to read everything, with patience, without assumption, looking for what was actually there rather than what she expected to see. Near the center of the formation, a natural fissure ran from ground level or upward, widening slightly at its base into a gap just wide enough for a small body to pass through. She moved to it, turned sideways, and pressed inside. The fissure opened into a cavity within the stone, roughly 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, ceiling low, 5 feet at its tallest, floor uneven with rubble and loose sand, dark and cold and smelling of mineral earth and the particular damp silence of enclosed stone. It was not a home. It was barely a hole. But Ada's father had taught her that potential is invisible to anyone who does not know how to look. A seed does not look like a tree. A spark does not look like a fire. A hole in a cliff does not look like a home until someone with knowledge and patience begins the work of making it one. She set down her cornmeal. She adjusted her mother's blanket. She pressed her palm flat against the back wall of the cavity and felt the stone cold dense, waiting. Then she got to work. The first day was 14 hours of unbroken labor. Ada used the hunting knife as a scraping tool, dragging the blade along the sandstone surface, peeling away thin layers that crumbled and accumulated in piles at her feet. Each hour produced perhaps half an inch of progress in any direction. By the time the light failed and her arms hung at her sides like objects belonging to someone else, the cavity had grown by a margin so small that a stranger standing at the entrance would not have noticed the difference. 4 blisters on her right hand, 3 on her left. Her shoulders burned from the inside. She sat by a small fire she had built beneath the overhang outside and did the arithmetic of survival. At this rate, she would need 8 weeks to carve a room large enough to live through winter. She had 4. The second morning brought a memory. Her father's voice, specific and clear from an afternoon in a canyon where he had shown her how the cliff dwellers of ancient times had shaped their homes. Never fight the rock. Stone has its own mind. It wants to break along certain lines along the layers where it was built up over millions of years. Find those lines, work with them. Let the rock tell you where it wants to come apart. Ada studied the walls of her cavity with entirely new attention. She ran her fingers along the surface, searching for the seams between layers, the places where one era of sandstone met another, where the stone's own history created natural fracture points. She gathered harder stones from the valley floor quartzite and granite carried down from the peaks by ancient floods and shaped them into crude chisels. She found a flat-top rock that fit her hand and could serve as a hammer. She positioned a chisel along a natural seam and struck. A slab of sandstone the size of her forearm broke away and fell with a clean, satisfying sound. She repositioned 3 inches to the left, struck again. Another slab. In 1 hour, she removed more stone than the entire previous day had yielded. The rock was not her enemy. The rock was her partner. And the partnership required only that Ada pay attention to what the stone was trying to tell her, which was she realized exactly what her father had spent her entire childhood teaching her to do with everything. By the end of the first week, the cavity had grown substantially. Her hands had become a geography of overlapping damage, old blisters breaking and bleeding before new ones formed beneath them, the skin of her palms thickening and toughening, as though her body understood that this was now its primary work. Her shoulders had settled into a deep, permanent ache that she stopped noticing because noticing it cost energy she could not spare. But the shape of a dwelling was emerging from the raw stone, the beginning of walls, the beginning of a ceiling with purpose, the beginning of something that could, with enough time and enough work, become a place where a person might actually survive. Then the storm came. It arrived on the last night of that first week, announced by a shift in the wind that Ada felt in her skin before she heard it, a pressure change, a coldness with a different quality, the particular stillness that precedes violence in the natural world. An October squall, not the killing winter she knew was still weeks away, but a messenger. A warning from the same system that would eventually descend on the territory with a fury that no living person had yet experienced. The wind came howling down from the north like something with intention. The fire went out not slowly, not gradually. A single savage gust tore through the entrance of her half-carved cave and snuffed the flame as casually as a man pinching a candle wick. In one heartbeat, Ada went from warmth and firelight to absolute darkness and cold so complete it felt like burial. She fumbled for her flint and steel in the dark, struck sparks. The wind caught them and scattered them to nothings. She struck again, crouching lower, trying to use her own body as a windbreak. The sparks flew and died. She struck again and again, each attempt producing a brief flash that showed her nothing except the darkness pressing in from every direction. She stopped. She sat in the complete dark with the wind screaming through her unfinished room, and she felt the temperature falling around her degree by degree. The kind of cold that does not arrive all at once, but creeps in from the edges, stealing warmth from your fingers first, then your feet, then the core of you, then finally the part of you that thinks clearly. And for the first time since her father's death, Ada Crane formed a thought with complete clinical clarity. I am going to die here. Not panic, arithmetic, no fire, temperature dropping below zero and continuing to fall. A body weighing less than 80 pounds does not produce enough heat to sustain itself through a night like this without an external source. These were facts, and facts did not care about courage or determination or the promises a girl had made standing over a grave at sunset. But then another fact surfaced, rising through the fear like a hand reaching up through dark water. Stone remembers warmth. Ada crawled deeper into the cave, away from the gaping entrance, and the wind pressing herself against the back wall where her fire had burned for 7 consecutive days. Her palms found the surface of the sandstone, and she felt it, faint, barely there, like the last warmth in a cup of coffee left sitting too long, but real, undeniably real. The stone had been absorbing heat from her fire for 7 days, drinking it in the way parched earth drinks rain. And now, with the flame gone, the stone was returning what it had been given, slowly, reluctantly, but steadily. Ada pressed her back against the warm wall, drew her knees to her chest, wrapped her mother's blanket around herself until only her eyes were exposed, and pressed her face into the wool. The ghost of lavender was still there, faint and stubborn, surviving in the fibers, the way certain things survive in a person, the voice of someone gone, the memory of a hand on a shoulder, the echo of a lesson learned beside a fire in the high country. She lay there through the longest night of her life, her spine against warm stone, her face against her mother's blanket. The wind and the darkness, held at bay by nothing more than the memory that rock carries inside itself and a scent of lavender from a woman she had never met. Dawn came gray and bitter cold. But Ada Crane was alive. She understood two things that morning with a clarity that would never leave her. The first was that thermal mass was real as gravity, as real as hunger, and that this single piece of knowledge passed from her father to her beside a campfire when she was 8 years old had just saved her life. The second was that she had to build the door before anything else, before expanding the cave, before gathering food, before any other task on the long list of tasks that stood between her and surviving the winter. Without a door, the next storm would kill her. The arithmetic was that simple. She spent 3 days felling dead aspen trees with her knife. Excruciating work. A hunting knife is built for cutting flesh, not wood, and each tree took hours of sawing and chopping that wore grooves into the blade and cracked open the half-healed blisters on her palms. She dragged the logs one at a time back to the cliff face, trimmed them, fitted them together with the patience of someone who understood completely that this was the most important structure she would ever build. She lashed the logs with strips of bark and twisted grass cord until she had a door that filled the entrance almost perfectly. The first time she closed that door and lit a fire inside the cave, the smoke rose straight and steady through a natural chimney crack in the ceiling above the fire pit. The heat spread outward into the surrounding stone, and the stone drank it in, and within an hour the cave was warm. Not comfortable, not by the standards of a proper house, but warm enough. Ada sat in that warmth with her back against the wall, and she wept. For the first time since her father's death, not from sadness, or not only from sadness, from something harder to name. From the overwhelming physical relief of a body that has been pushed to its absolute limit and discovered with surprise and gratitude that the limit has not yet been reached. And from gratitude for a father who had spent a lifetime accumulating knowledge and who had spent every day of her childhood giving it away piece by piece, lesson by lesson, until the girl he was raising carried enough of it inside her to survive what should have been unsurvivable. Thomas Crane had saved his daughter's life from beyond the grave. The instrument of salvation was nothing more than a sentence spoken beside a campfire years ago in a high country canyon on a night when the stars were bright enough to make a child believe the sky was listening. Stone remembers warmth. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as precise and relentless as a heartbeat. Dawn to midday carve. Expand the main chamber, smooth the walls, deepen the fire pit, shape alcoves for storage. By the end of the second week, the room measured 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling that peaked at 7 feet in the center. The fire pit sat near the entrance beneath the chimney crack, and the surrounding stone radiated warmth through the night with a slow, steady pulse. Midday to late afternoon, hunt and gather. Ada checked the snare lines she had set along rabbit runs throughout the valley, simple traps of twisted grass positioned with the care she had been taught along paths so faint that an untrained eye would never find them. The rabbits provided meat and fur. She gathered pine nuts from the trees that dotted the valley floor, collecting the small, oily seeds that were dense with the fat and calories her growing body needed. She collected rose hips from wild bushes along the creek, drying them on flat rocks near the fire for tea that would provide something essential through the months ahead. She dug roots and tubers from the earth, roasting them in the coals until they were soft enough to eat. Late afternoon to dark process and store. Scrape rabbit hides and stretch them on frames of bent willow. Turn the drying meat, stack firewood in rows against the back wall. Weave grass containers for storing what she had gathered. And always, always read the signs. Watch the sky, feel the wind, count the days remaining before the real winter arrived. There was an evening during the third week that was not dramatic in any way. No storm, no crisis, no test of survival. Ada simply sat before her fire after a long day of work, looked at the smooth stone walls she had made with her own hands and spoke to the cave. I am all right, Pa. The cave stays warm through the night. Plenty of rabbits. I remember everything you taught me. Silence. Fire crackling. Wind pushing softly at the door. I miss you. That was all. Two words spoken to no one, or to a dead man, or to the stone walls that had absorbed so many hours of heat and were giving it back slowly, steadily, without being asked. Just a girl alone in a room she had carved from the mountain, talking to her father because there was no one else to talk to, and then turning back to her work because work was the only prayer the wilderness accepted. The wolves came on a night in early November. The first true cold had clamped down on the valley, stars burning with the particular brightness that comes when the air has been scrubbed clean by temperatures that punish any remaining moisture. The kind of cold that turns breath to crystals before it travels 6 inches from your lips. Ada had built her fire high barred her door and was drifting towards sleep when the first howl split the darkness. Close, sharp, hungry. Then another and another until the night vibrated with voices that bypassed the ears entirely and communicated directly with the oldest part of the human brain, the part that remembers across 10,000 years of civilization when we were prey. She grabbed her knife and pressed her spine against the back wall and listened, scratching at the base of the door, claws on frozen ground, sniffing through the gaps between the logs, wet, urgent, investigative. A low, rumbling growl that she felt in her ribs and her sternum and her back teeth. They worked at the door for hours, threw their weight against the one, circled the cliff face searching for another weakness, another way in. Ada fed the fire with wood she had spent weeks gathering, watching each log turn to ash, calculating the cost against the necessity. Every stick she burned tonight was a stick she would not have in January. She burned them anyway, because January was a problem for a girl who survived until January. Dawn came. The wolves retreated. Ada opened the door cautiously, knife in hand, and found something she had not expected. A single wolf lay in the snow near the spring. A female gray, her fur matted and darkened with blood along her left side where another wolf's teeth had torn through hide and muscle. A fight within the pack over food or rank or territory, and she had lost, and the pack had left her behind, the way packs leave behind anything that can no longer keep up. She lay in the snow, breathing in short, agonized gasps, watching Ada with yellow eyes that held no aggression and no plea. Just the flat, steady regard of a creature that knows it is dying and is waiting for the process to finish. Ada stood at the entrance of her cave and looked at the wolf for a long time. She could have killed her, one clean thrust of the knife, fur for additional warmth, meat for additional food. It would have been the practical choice, the survival choice, the choice that almost any adult in her position would have made without hesitation. Instead, she built a small fire near the spring. She melted snow for water. She approached the injured wolf with steps so deliberate and slow that covering 10 feet took 5 full minutes, not because she was afraid, though she was, but because the wolf needed to understand at whatever level wolves understand things that the small human was not a threat. The wolf growled when Ada came close, a sound that had once carried menace but now carried only exhaustion. Ada knelt in the snow beside her. The wound was deep but not immediately fatal, the kind of injury that kills through infection over days rather than blood loss over minutes. She cleaned it with spring water. She packed it with a poultice of moss and the medicinal herbs her father had shown her, the same mixture Thomas Crane had used on his own injuries in the high country. Then she reached for her mother's a blanket. The lavender was still there, faint and stubborn and irreplaceable. Ada tore strips from the edge of the blanket, from the only thing in the world that still held a trace of the mother she had never met, and used those strips to bind the poultice against the wolf's wound. The wolf watched her hands throughout the entire process with yellow eyes that tracked every movement with absolute attention. She did not bite. She did not struggle. Something in her had recognized something in Ada. Two creatures left behind by their own kind. Two beings abandoned to the cold by those who should have stayed. When the bandaging was complete, Ada retreated to her cave and left dried rabbit meat within the wolf's reach. She watched from her doorway as the animal struggled upright, ate, and limped toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, the wolf stopped, turned her head, and for a long, suspended moment across the blood-stained snow, the girl and the wolf regarded each other with the wordless understanding of two species that have always known each other better than neither has been willing to admit. Then the wolf disappeared into the trees. The horse appeared 2 weeks later. A Mustang stallion, the color of morning mist, standing near the spring, drinking with the desperate urgency of an animal that has not had water in days. His coat shifted between gray and silver in the pale light. His mane was tangled with burrs. His ribs were visible beneath his winter coat. His right rear leg was swollen and hot, the injury severe enough that he could barely transfer weight onto it, separated from his herd, slowed by the wound, left to manage alone. Ada understood looking at him that a horse would change everything. A horse could carry supplies and haul timber and provide warmth. But a wild Mustang could also kill an 11-year-old girl with a single kick. Earning his trust could not be rushed. Day one, Ada sat at the far edge of the valley, visible but distant, motionless for hours. The horse watched her with every muscle coiled for flight. As the hours accumulated and the human made no move, something in his calculation shifted, not trust, but the reduction of fear from immediate to manageable. Day two, closer by 20 feet, a handful of dry grass left on a flat rock. Retreat. Watch the horse approach, sniff, eat, raise his head, and look at her with something that was not yet curiosity, but was no longer pure suspicion. Day three, day four, day five. Closer each day, more food, more patience, more of the slow accumulation of evidence that this particular human was not a threat. On the ninth day, the horse walked to Ada on his own, extended his muzzle and sniffed her outstretched hand, and for the first time allowed her to touch the side of his neck. She felt his heartbeat through the coat, rapid and weary, but present. She felt the warmth of his body and the slight trembling that was fear in the process of becoming something else. "We are the same," she said quietly, "left behind, separated from our own." She named him Ghost for the color of his coat and for the way he appeared and disappeared in the morning mist that rose from the spring. She treated his injured leg with the same poultice she had used on the wolf and Ghost, allowed the treatment with the patience of an animal that understands at some level beneath language that help is being offered. By the end of the second week, he followed Ada into the cave willingly. The second chamber she had carved for storage became his stable, and his body heat added a warmth to the entire cave system that made the difference between a dwelling that was merely survivable and one that was genuinely sufficient. But Ghost provided something more important than warmth. He provided company. Ada began talking to him the way she had once talked to her father. Her plans, her fears, her observations about the sky and the wind and the behavior of animals in the valley below. Ghost listened with his ears pricked forward and occasionally pressed his nose against her shoulder in a gesture she came to understand as something like affection. "You and I are the same," she told him one evening as the last of autumn died outside the cave. "Left behind by our own kind, but we did not die. We found each other instead." Ghost snickered softly in response. And for the first time since her father's death, something like peace found its way into the stone room where a girl and a horse breathed together in the firelight. 20 miles south, Harrowfield settled into a complacency that would prove catastrophic. The autumn remained mild. The cattle were fat and healthy. Reverend Solomon Hale preached sermons of thanksgiving, congratulating his congregation on their collective wisdom. Gerald Voss counted his herd and told anyone who would listen that he had never seen a finer October, while his private cellar held stores enough to last his family through the worst of what Ada had predicted. Fletcher Wade collected on a side bet that the strange girl from the storeroom would not last a week. But 3 people in Harrowfield were quietly doing something different. Old Silas Drum sat on his porch each morning and watched the sky with eyes that had been reading Montana weather since before most of the town's residents were born. He watched the birds leaving early and the squirrels cashing with a manic urgency that spoke of something beyond ordinary preparation, and his back ached where old injuries met the changing barometric pressure, an internal barometer that had never once lied to him in 72 years. He went to Dr. Holt one final time, told him that 1856 had started exactly like this. Pleasant autumn, everyone comfortable, then snow that did not stop for 3 months. The doctor patted his arm with the gentle condescension reserved for the elderly and told him the mind plays tricks as we age. Silas went home and continued stockpiling with the grim efficiency of a man who knows exactly what 3 months of snow looks like from the inside. Ruth Hale found herself drawn to the window each evening, staring north toward the hills where the girl had gone. She had not voted to exile Ada. She had not spoken to defend her either. That silence had become a weight she carried everywhere, a stone in her chest that grew heavier with each mild, comfortable, unsuspecting day. She began hiding food behind the preserves in her pantry, adding a little more each week, a secret store that her husband would never think to look for, because Solomon Hale had never in 20 years of marriage looked in the pantry. Callum Briggs lay awake at night, thinking about the knife. His father had noticed its absence, had questioned him, had accepted a stammered excuse about losing it somewhere on the range. The lie festered. But in the dark, with the wind picking up outside his window, in a way that felt wrong for the season, Callum closed his eyes and hoped with everything he had that the knife was cutting wood somewhere in the hills north of town, in the hands of a girl with gray eyes who had been right about everything. November 12th, 1886. The snow began at dawn, soft and heavy, the kind of wet snow that clings to everything it touches and builds with startling speed. By noon, the wind had arrived, transforming the gentle snowfall into something horizontal and merciless. By evening, visibility had dropped below 50 feet, and the temperature had fallen to 20 below zero, and was still dropping. In her cave, Ada watched through the gap beside her door. Ghost stood behind her, his ears swiveling as he detected changes in air pressure that human senses could not register. "It is starting," Ada said quietly, just like I said it would. The storm did not stop. For 9 consecutive days, the wind howled, piling snow into drifts that rose higher with each passing hour. The temperature bottomed out at 40 below and stayed there as though the cold had decided this was its permanent address. The sky remained an unbroken wall of gray. Dawn and dusk blurred together into an endless twilight of falling white. In Harrowfield, catastrophe unfolded with the methodical patience of something that had been planning for a long time. The cattle died first. Gerald Voss's prize herd, the animals he had counted with such satisfaction just weeks before, ceased to exist over the course of 7 days. 50 in the first hours, frozen in the draws where they had sought shelter from a wind that offered none. 400 by the third day. Over 1,000 by the week's end. Across the valley, every ranch lost everything. The economic foundation of Harrowfield, the thing that had given the town its entire reason for existing, vanished under white silence. Then the food ran out. Mrs. Vance's store, which had seemed adequately stocked in October, was nearly empty by Christmas. Families who had entered winter with the easy confidence of people who have never been truly hungry found their pantries bare and their options gone. Hunters went out and returned empty-handed, their faces white with frostbite, their spirits cracking. The elk had moved weeks before the storm. The deer had followed. The rabbits had burrowed so deep that even experienced trappers could not locate them. By January, Harrowfield was starving. The deaths came one by one. Walter Drummond, old Silas's younger brother, went to fetch firewood from the pile beside his house, a distance of 30 feet, and did not make it back. His wife found him the next morning, one hand reaching toward the door handle. Old Silas stood over his brother's body for a long time and said nothing. He had warned them. The girl had warned them. And being right about a disaster is the loneliest kind of being right that exists in this world. The Sutton baby was next, 8 months old, a fever that no amount of care could break because everything that might have broken it was gone. She died in Clara Sutton's arms on a night when the wind outside the cabin sounded like screaming. Edmund Sutton went out into the storm to hack a grave from earth frozen as hard as iron, came back with frostbitten hands, and 3 weeks later went out to fetch firewood 20 feet from his own door. The blizzard swallowed him. He walked in circles. His tracks filled in almost as fast as he made them. They found his body in the spring, one hand reaching toward the house he could not see. Fletcher Wade lost 2 fingers to frostbite after stepping outside for 3 minutes to check on his forge. Dr. Holt amputated them with a saw and whiskey, while Wade bit down on a leather strap and made no sound at all. The man who had laughed loudest when Ada Crane was driven out of town never made a joke about anything for the rest of his life. By February, Harrowfield had buried 28 of its own, and the name that Reverend Solomon Hale had banished from the vocabulary of his congregation was beginning to surface in whispered conversations in darkened rooms, in the desperate counsels of families who had run out of options and were beginning to understand, with a cold and terrible clarity, that they had thrown away the one person who had tried to save them. The name came back slowly, the way feeling comes back to a frozen hand, painful, uncertain, arriving in pieces rather than all at once. It began in whispers. In the dark spaces between families huddled around fires that were burning lower each day. In the pauses between words when people were trying to talk about their options and finding with increasing desperation that the list of options had grown very short. The name moved through Harrowfield the way all necessary truths eventually move through communities that have tried to suppress them underground first before finally breaking the surface where everyone could see it. Ada Crane, the girl they had sent away, the girl who had known. It was Callum Briggs who finally said it out loud in a room full of people. He stood before the emergency council gathered in Gerald Voss's house, the largest structure still adequately heated, the only place warm enough to hold a meeting of more than 4 adults. Callum was 15 now. His father had died 2 weeks earlier, gone out to search for a calf lost in a whiteout, and never come back. The boy who stood before the council was not quite the boy who had pressed a hunting knife into a girl's hand on the morning of her exile. Grief and cold and hunger had forged him into a different shape. Harder, older, carrying a weight in his eyes that no 15-year-old should ever have to carry. Ada Crane, he said. The name entered the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward and touched every person present, and nobody spoke for a long moment. The girl we sent away, Callum, continued. The girl who stood in Mrs. Vance's store and told us exactly what was coming. My father believed her. He told me before he died, he said, find the Crane girl. He said she knew things we did not know. He said we threw away the one person who could have helped us. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who know something is true and are struggling with the cost of admitting it. Gerald Voss, who had lost his cattle and most of his pride, and was sitting with the collapsed posture of a man whose certainty has been systematically demolished, spoke without looking up. The girl is dead. No child could survive alone out there. Not in this. Old Silas Drum, from his corner, his voice thin but entirely steady. Her father survived alone in those mountains for years at a stretch. And the girl is her father's daughter. I told her where to go. If she found those cliffs, if she had enough time to prepare before the worst of it hit, she may still be alive. Dr. Bernard Holt, still clinging to the last shredded remnants of his professional authority, adjusted his spectacles and said, even if by some miracle she survived, what could a child possibly offer us now? Callum turned on the doctor with eyes that burned. She predicted this winter, 6 weeks before the first flake fell. She read it in the animals, and the beaver dams, and the caterpillars, and the bees, and she was right about every single detail. So I will ask you the same question in reverse, Dr. Holt. What exactly have you offered us? The doctor had no answer. Ruth Hale spoke from the doorway. She had come without her husband's knowledge, slipping out of the parsonage while Solomon prayed in his study. If Ada is alive, she said carefully, she may know where to find food. She may have shelter large enough for others. She may be the only chance we have left. The Reverend's wife had spoken publicly against the Reverend's judgment. The room understood the significance of that. Then came the sound of boots on the floorboards, and Reverend Solomon Hale filled the doorway. He had followed his wife through the cold without his coat, and the fact that he had not noticed the cold was itself a kind of statement about the state of the man. His face was a controlled fury, 9 parts fear and 1 part the genuine outrage of someone who has built his entire identity on a foundation that is visibly crumbling beneath him. You would send men to beg mercy from the very child I condemned, he said. His voice still carried its old authority, but the resonance was hollow now in a way that everyone in the room could hear. You would place the lives of this congregation in the hands of a girl I cast out in the name of God. Ruth turned to face her husband. I would have us live, she said. I would have the children in this town live. If that means going to the girl we wronged and asking her help, then yes, Solomon, that is what I would do. Wouldn't you? He had no answer, but what happened next revealed the true distance between who Solomon Hale believed himself to be and who he actually was. He began to argue against the search, not simply declining to participate, but actively, methodically working to prevent it. He framed it as spiritual leadership, as protection of the congregation's dignity, as concern for the men who might die attempting the journey. He used every tool of rhetoric that 20 years behind a pulpit had given him, and he used them all in the service of preventing a search that might prove beyond any remaining possibility of denial that he had been catastrophically, lethally wrong. He was not protecting his congregation. He was protecting himself. Ruth Hale watched her husband speak. She watched his hands move with their familiar gestures of emphasis. She watched his eyes, which had once held something genuine, and were now holding only the desperate performance of a man trying to prevent his own reckoning. She watched him for a long time. That night she packed what she could carry into a canvas bag. She put on every layer of clothing she owned. She left no letter because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in every look and silence and turned away moment of the past 6 months. She walked out of the parsonage into the frozen dark and did not look back. The search party was organized the following morning. 5 men on the strongest remaining horses carrying what little food could be spared. Callum Briggs insisted on leading. Gerald Voss joined, carrying with him a guilt that had become indistinguishable from physical weight. Fletcher Wade came despite his bandaged hands, the grip of a man who needs to do something, anything, to begin paying a debt he now understood he owed. Dr. Holt came because the alternative was staying behind with his useless credentials and his demolished certainty, and he found he could not bear that. The 5th man was never named in any account of the journey, which perhaps says everything necessary about the way history treats ordinary courage. They rode north into the hills. The conditions were unlike anything any of them had experienced. The wind came in sideways, turning the air into something almost solid. The cold pressed against every surface of exposed skin with focused malice. The horses moved through drifts, chest deep in places, laboring with a determination that was painful to witness, their breath coming in great ragged clouds that froze before they could fully form. The first night they huddled in the shelter of a rock outcropping, pressed together for warmth, speaking almost nothing, because speech required energy they could not spare. Voss stared at the darkness and said quietly, more to himself than to anyone, that the girl was dead. That they were killing themselves for nothing, that by morning they should turn back. Callum said nothing. He lay in his blankets and stared at the rock above him and thought about a knife, about the weight of it in his hand on a September morning, about gray eyes that had not flinched when 47 people voted to erase the person behind them, about a voice that had said, I will be waiting for you there, and the way those words had been haunting him for 5 months with the persistence of something true. At dawn, he mounted his horse and rode north. The others followed. On the 2nd May, a horse collapsed from cold and exhaustion and had to be left. 4 men on 3 horses, now the weakest of them, rotating on foot. Frostbite claimed the tip of Callum's nose, and crept into Voss's ears and found the gaps in Fletcher Wade's bandaged hands and worked at them with patient cruelty. The third day dawned gray, and still the wind dropped for the first time in weeks, and in that comparative quiet, the landscape acquired a different quality, something almost beautiful in its severity. The snow unmarked for miles in every direction, the sky the pale white gray of old bone. And then through a break in the clouds, Callum saw it. A wisp of gray rising from a cliff face half a mile ahead. So thin, it could have been imagination. So steady, it could only be real. Smoke from a fire that someone was tending, in a dwelling that someone had built. Nobody spoke. They simply urged their exhausted horses forward, moving through the last stretch of open ground toward the cliff face with the desperate, disbelieving urgency of people who have been surviving on diminishing hope and have just seen something that might justify having survived at all. The cliff face appeared exactly as old Silas Drum had described it, 40 feet of red gold sandstone, ancient and layered, glowing even in the pale winter light, with a warmth that seemed to come from within the stone itself. At the base of the formation, sheltered beneath a natural overhang, was an entrance fitted with a door made from aspen logs cut and trimmed and lashed together with such precision that it seemed to grow from the stone rather than having been constructed against it. The smoke rose from a crack in the rock above, thin and gray and absolutely steady. They dismounted on legs that had forgotten how to properly function. Callum held the saddle horn for a long moment before he trusted himself to stand. He walked to the door. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, the sound enormous in the silence that had replaced the wind. He raised his fist and knocked. The sound of movement from inside. Wood scraping against stone, something being lifted and set aside. Then the door swung inward. Warm air rushed out into the frozen world like the exhalation of something alive, and the warmth hit Callum's face and his cracked lips, in his frost-damaged nose with an almost physical force, and his eyes stung, and his throat closed, and his hands began to shake with something that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ada Crane stood in the entrance of her stone home. She was thin, but not starving, lean in the way that months of hard physical work and careful rationing produce a leanness that is not weakness, but its opposite. Her face was darkened by months of wind and reflected firelight. Her dark hair was tied back with a strip of leather. She wore a coat made entirely from rabbit fur, dozens of pelts stitched together with rawhide, each one a record of a morning's patient work along the snare lines of the valley. Her hands bore the thick layered calluses of someone who had been working stone and wood and animal hide for months without pause. Her gray eyes were exactly as Callum remembered them, still, deep, older than the face that held them, and holding now a quality he had not seen before, the particular steadiness of a person who has been tested at the level where testing becomes permanent and who is not broken. Behind her, firelight played across walls that had been smoothed by patient labor. Stacks of firewood stood in precise rows against the back wall. Bundles of dried meat hung from pegs driven into the stone. Woven grass containers held stores of nuts and dried roots. And in an adjoining chamber, a gray horse nickered, softly watching the strangers with dark, cautious eyes, his silver coat catching the firelight. "You came," Ada said. Not a question, not surprise, not triumph or vindication. Just the quiet, level acknowledgement of a fact that had been known for a long time. Then she said the words that stopped every heart in the group. "I have been expecting you for 6 weeks. I prepared extra chambers in the nearby caves. I mapped the Elk Valley where game winters over. I gathered enough to help 100 people, because I knew when the winter came and did what I told you it would do, that whoever survived would need somewhere to go." The 5 men stood in the warmth pouring from a cave built by an 11-year-old girl they had helped to exile, and the weight of everything, every death, every empty pantry, every frozen grave hacked from iron earth, pressed down on all of them simultaneously. Gerald Voss was the first to break. He went to his knees on the stone floor, and the sound his body made was the sound of something held upright too long by pride finally being released. His face crumbled. Tears formed and froze on his cheeks before they could fall. "I called you a liar," he said. "I voted to send you away. I stood up in that room and led the argument against you. And I went home that same night and added to my private stores because I believed you were right, and I said nothing, and people died while I had food locked in my cellar." He dropped his head. He had said the true thing finally, and the true thing was exactly as heavy as he had always known it would be. Fletcher Wade held up his bandaged hands, the stumps of his missing fingers seeping through the cloth. When he spoke, his voice had been stripped of everything that had once characterized it, the easy mockery, the reflexive cruelty, the loudness he had mistaken his entire life for strength. "I bet $5 you were already dead," he said. "I laughed when they drove you out. There is nothing I can offer you except the truth of what I am, which is a man who was wrong in the worst possible way at the worst possible time." Dr. Bernard Holt stood apart from the others. He had not knelt. He did not weep. His face was the color of old paper and held the expression of a man watching the demolition of the structure his entire identity had been built upon. "I told this town there was no scientific basis for your predictions," he said. "I used my education and my position to dismiss you in terms that gave other people permission to dismiss you too. I have 3 medical degrees. I have read more books than anyone else in this territory. An 11-year-old girl who learned by watching animals knew more about surviving in this place than everything I studied in all those years combined. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am simply stating the fact because it is the only honest thing I have left to offer." Callum stood apart from the others. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "I always believed you. My father believed you too. He died saying you would know what to do. He made me promise to find you." He reached into his coat and produced the hunting knife. His grandfather's knife, which Ada had returned to him silently when she first opened the door, understanding that it needed to come back to him. He held it out. He said to tell you the knife was always meant to be yours. He said a tool belongs to whoever can use it best. Ada looked at the knife for a moment. Then she took it back. This time she held it not as a borrowed thing, but as what it had always been. The silence that followed was long enough for the fire to crack twice and for the full weight of everything to settle completely on every person in the cave. Then Ada spoke. "My father used to say that the wilderness gives no second chances to those who ignore its warnings." She looked at each face in turn. "But I am not the wilderness." She let those words stand alone for a moment. Something in her face was opening. Not softening exactly, but unlocking like a door that has been bolted from the inside for a very long time and is now being unbolted, not because the threat outside is past, but because the person inside has decided that keeping it bolted is its own kind of defeat. "There is a valley 3 miles east of here," she said. "The elk winter there. The snow is lighter because of the way the cliff formations block the prevailing wind. Your hunters will find game. And there are natural caves in this formation. I have mapped them and expanded 3 of them over the past 6 weeks. The stone holds heat. Families can shelter there until the spring thaw if they are willing to work and willing to learn." Gerald Voss looked up from his knees. "You would help us, after everything." "The children in Harrowfield did not vote to cast me out," Ada said. "The babies who are starving did not call me devil-touched. I will not let the innocent suffer to punish the guilty. That is not justice. That is just a different kind of cruelty." She moved toward the entrance of the cave. "Rest tonight, warm yourselves. Tomorrow we ride to Harrowfield and we bring everyone back. Every single person, even the ones who hate me most." She paused at the doorway and looked back at them. "Especially them," she said. The evacuation of Harrowfield began 3 days later before dawn in the gray half-light that precedes a Montana sunrise in February and makes the world look like a photograph of itself taken from very far away. Ada rode Ghost to the edge of town and sat on the silver horse, and watched the survivors emerge from their homes one by one, two by two, family by family. They came out blinking and shivering and carrying whatever they could hold. A woman clutched a cast iron pan to her chest as though it were an infant. A man dragged a wooden chest through the snow until a neighbor helped him lift it onto a sled made from a barn door. Children appeared wrapped in so many layers that they could barely bend their arms. Their faces barely visible between scarves and hats, their eyes enormous, with a fear that no child should know. 112 people. That was all that remained of a community that had numbered 140. 28 graves in frozen ground, 28 empty chairs, and the 112 who remained were about to place their lives in the hands of the girl they had sent away to die. Ada watched them gather and felt something she could not immediately name. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the vindication she might have been entitled to feel. Something quieter than all of those things. The recognition that these were simply people, fragile and frightened and capable of terrible things, and also capable of stumbling through waist-deep snow before dawn because they wanted their children to live. Not monsters, not heroes. The complicated, contradictory things that all human beings are. One person did not come. Reverend Solomon Hale stood in the doorway of his church as the evacuation assembled in the street below. He had watched his wife leave. He had watched his congregation make their preparations to follow a girl he had condemned in the name of God. He stood in the doorway of the building where he had preached for 20 years, and his face held the expression of a man who has reached a place inside himself where two things he cannot reconcile are finally meeting each other, and he has no more moves left. Ruth went to him one last time. She stood at the bottom of the church steps and looked up at her husband and asked him to come. She used the word please. She used it more than once. She told him that there was nothing in that church worth dying for. She told him that she loved him, which was the truest and the hardest thing she said, and which cost her more than anything else. Solomon Hale looked down at his wife from the doorway of his church. I condemn that girl in the name of the Lord, he said. I cannot now seek salvation from her hand. If I was wrong, then everything I have built and everything I have taught and everything I have been for 20 years is built on sand. And I would rather die in this church than live with that. Ruth looked at her husband for a long time. She memorized his face with the deliberate attention of someone who understands they are seeing something for the last time. Then she turned and walked north with the others. She did not look back. Ada led the column through mountain passes that no adult in Harrowfield had ever noticed, along trails that seemed to materialize beneath ghost hooves, as though the landscape had decided to cooperate, to caves and sheltered valleys that existed on no surveyor's map, because the only people who had ever mapped them were a dead trapper named Thomas Crane and the daughter who carried his knowledge forward like a candle cupped in careful hands against the wind. She organized the survivors with a quiet authority that no one questioned. Families were assigned to caves based on size and the number of small children they were managing. Hunting parties were directed to the Elk Valley, where they found game exactly as Ada had promised. Foraging teams were shown food sources they had walked past for years without recognizing roots and tubers and pine nuts and the dried seed heads of plants that looked like nothing but contained enough nutrition to matter. She taught them everything. How to seal a cave entrance with packed snow and brush to stop drafts while still allowing ventilation. How to build a fire that heated the surrounding stone rather than simply warming the air so that the heat lasted through the night long after the flame had died down. How to smoke meat so it would keep for months. How to read the behavior of animals to know when it was safe to venture out and when stepping through a doorway into a Montana February would kill you before you made it 10 feet. The knowledge that Thomas Crane had accumulated over a lifetime, inherited from his father and his grandfather, carried across generations from the Scottish Highlands to the mountains of Montana, now flowed outward from his daughter to an entire community, given without conditions, given without demands for gratitude or apology, given because gifts are meant to be given. because that was what her father had taught her. Because breaking that chain would have been its own kind of loss, Mrs. Agnes Vance worked alongside the other women in complete silence, moving with the concentrated energy of someone who has decided that the only available penance is usefulness. She did not meet Ada's eyes. She offered no excuses and no theatrical sympathy. But late one night when the sheltered valley was quiet and the fires were banked and the only sounds were breathing and wind, she left a small bundle outside the entrance to Ada's cave. Inside was a wool scarf hand-knitted with a care that was visible in every stitch, and a folded note containing 5 words, "For the winter that taught me." Ada found it in the morning. She wore that scarf for the rest of her life. Ruth Hale came to Ada on the second day at the cliffs. She had walked out of 20 years of marriage and into the snow, and the weight of that choice showed in every line of her body and the way she could not quite stand straight, as though some internal architecture that had held her upright for decades had finally irrevocably shifted. She knelt in the snow in front of Ada. "I knew you were right," Ruth said. "From the afternoon I stopped to ask you what you saw in the sky. I knew. And I said nothing. I did nothing. I was a coward." Ada looked at this small woman with her careful hands and her careful eyes, the only adult in Harrowfield who had ever offered her a moment of genuine recognition, the only one who had spoken her father's name without contempt. "You are here," Ada said. "You chose to come. You left everything to come. That is not nothing. That is the thing that matters." They found Solomon Hale in April when the spring thaw finally allowed a party to return to what remained of Harrowfield. He was seated in the front pew of his church in the center of the row in the position he had occupied every Sunday morning for 20 years. His Bible was in his hands, the leather cover fused to his skin by the cold, so that the book and the man had become a single object. His face was turned toward the altar. His eyes were closed. He had not died of cold. He had died of hunger slowly over weeks as his body consumed itself from the inside while the oil lamps ran dry and the windows frosted over, and the silence of the empty pews became the only congregation left to hear him. He had refused to leave his church, refused to seek food or warmth from any source outside those walls. He had sat in the growing darkness, in the growing cold, and he had prayed, and the prayer had been answered with the only response that absolute certainty ultimately deserves the truth that he was alone, and that the aloneness was the consequence of a choice he had made and could not unmake. They buried him in the churchyard. The service was short. He was not a monster. He was a cautionary tale, a man who had started with something real and allowed it to calcify over 20 years of unchallenged authority into something rigid and brittle and ultimately fatal. He had died not because God abandoned him, but because he could not tell the difference between his own pride and the will of God. And by the time that difference mattered, he had lost the capacity to learn it. The gathering came in May. The snow had pulled back at last, retreating from the valley floor to reveal the damage beneath collapsed structures, frozen carcasses, the raw new graves that dotted the landscape. The survivors assembled in the open air, 112 people standing in the pale spring sunlight, with the particular posture of those who have come through something that has permanently altered their understanding of what they are capable of enduring. Callum Briggs spoke first. He was 16 now, with a face that had been rearranged by the winter into something that would never entirely go back to what it had been before. "We sent a child into the wilderness to die," he said. "We called her a liar when she told us the truth. We cast her out because she made us uncomfortable, because she knew things we did not understand, because it was easier to silence her than to listen." He turned to look at Ada, who stood apart from the group, with ghost reins in her hand, the gray horse beside her like a silver shadow. "Ada Crane saved every person standing here. Every one of us owes our life to a girl we treated as less than nothing." Others spoke. The mothers whose children had survived because Ada had shown them where to find food. The hunters who had followed her directions to the Elk Valley and returned with meat when meat was the difference between another week of life and another grave. The families who had sheltered in the caves she had mapped and expanded, who had slept warm beside fires she had taught them to build in the way that made the stone itself into a source of heat. Clara Sutton spoke last. She had lost her baby and her husband in the same winter to the same cold, in the same town that had silenced the one person who had tried to warn them. She stood before Ada with the eyes of a woman who has had everything taken from her and has been required to keep breathing anyway, and who has discovered with a kind of astonished bitterness that the body's insistence on survival does not wait for the heart's permission. "You had every right to turn us away," Clara said. "Every single right. We gave you nothing and took everything and sent you out to die, and you came back and saved our children." Her voice broke on the next word. Why Ada did not answer immediately. She looked at Clara Sutton, at the spaces in her eyes where things had lived that were gone now, at the trembling in her hands, even in the warmth of the May morning. Then she looked out at the assembled faces of the people who had exiled her, and the people who had said nothing, and the people who had tried and failed to stop it. "When I was 9 years old," she said quietly, "I buried my father with my own hands. 2 days, rocky ground. I had nothing but his knife and what he had given me. And when I finished, I made him a promise. I promised that what he knew would not die with him, that I would carry it forward and give it away the way he had given it to me, without conditions, without keeping score." She paused. Around her, the May wind moved through the new grass of the valley, and the first birds of the season called from the tree line, and the mountains stood their eternal watch above everything indifferent and magnificent and unchanged. "My father never said to only help the people who deserve it. He never said to let the children of your enemies go hungry. He said knowledge is a gift and gifts are meant to be given. That is the whole of it." She looked at Clara directly. "Your baby did not vote to cast me out. Your husband did not stand in that church and call me devil-touched. They died because other people made choices for them. The children who sheltered in those caves, the women who carried them through the snow, the old people too weak to walk without help, they are not my enemies. They are just people. And people, unlike mountains, can change." She helped Clara to her feet. "You asked why I saved you. The truth is simpler than it sounds. I saved you because I could. Because my father's voice in my head said that the person who lets the innocent suffer to punish the guilty is no better than the guilty themselves. Because the mountains taught me how to survive. But my father taught me what survival is for." Clara Sutton wept not the hollow, tearless grief of the winter months, but the real kind, the kind that comes when something frozen deep inside a person begins to thaw, and the body decides with great caution and great relief that it might be safe to feel again. Ada put her hand on Clara's shoulder and stayed there silent, offering nothing except the simple and sufficient fact of another human being willing to remain present. When Clara finally rose, there was something different in her face. Not healed. Healing would take far longer than a single morning in May, but open. Open to the possibility that the world still contained things worth moving toward. Harrowfield was rebuilt, though it was never the same. The cattle industry that had been its entire reason for existing was shattered beyond recovery, and the community that rose from the wreckage was smaller and humbler, and structured differently, diversified in its food sources, deliberate in its preparations, careful with its stores in the way that people are careful after they have learned exactly what carelessness costs. They built stronger structures designed for the weather they actually lived in. They stockpiled with the meticulous attention of people who understood that preparation was not pessimism, but the most basic form of respect for the life you had been given. And they listened. When the old-timers spoke of weather signs and animal behavior and the patterns that nature uses to communicate with anyone willing to pay attention, people listened. When children made observations that adults found strange or inconvenient, parents considered them instead of dismissing them. When someone offered a warning, the community prepared instead of ridiculing. The phrase "reading the signs" entered the vocabulary of that part of Montana and stayed there, passed from generation to generation, carrying with it the unspoken memory of what had happened to a community that had forgotten how. Ada did not return to live in Harrowfield. She remained at the cliff caves, expanding them over the years into a complex of interconnected chambers that could shelter 30 people if the need arose. She became a guide for those crossing the mountains, a teacher for those who wanted to learn the old skills, a living repository of knowledge that stretched back through her father and his father and his father before him to the Scottish Highlands and beyond, to the first human beings who looked at a cliff face and saw not just rock, but the possibility of a home. Callum Briggs was the first student. He spent 3 summers learning everything Ada could teach, then returned to what remained of Harrowfield and built a school, not the kind with desks and rows, and a teacher who had never slept outdoors, but a different kind where children learned to read and write alongside the skills that the land itself demanded, where the curriculum included not just the knowledge of civilization, but the knowledge of the world that civilization had built itself upon and then forgotten. Old Silas Drum died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, having lived long enough to see his warnings validated and the knowledge he had carried alone for 6 decades finally flowing outward to people who were ready to receive it. His last words were to his great-granddaughter, a girl of 9, who had just returned from her first summer studying with Ada at the cliffs. "Remember what you learned up there?" the old man whispered. "Remember that nature tells the truth even when people lie." Clara Sutton remarried 3 years after the Great Winter. She named her second son Edmund after the husband who had frozen to death 20 feet from his own door. She named her third son Thomas after the trapper who had spent his life accumulating knowledge and giving it away. She raised 5 children, and when any of them asked about the winter, she told them the whole story, every part of it, because she believed that a story only protects the future if it is told honestly. Ghost the Gray Mustang lived to the remarkable age of 26. He died on a warm summer night in 1904, his great body finally giving out after years of service that had long since exceeded anything a horse owes a human. Ada buried him near the entrance to the cave in a grave she dug herself the way she had dug her father's grave so many years before. The headstone was carved from the same sandstone as the walls of their shared home. It read simply, "Ghost, found me when I needed finding." In the years that followed, the wolves of that part of Montana gave Ada and her students a wide berth. The pack circled around rather than through their territory, retreated rather than confronted, as though some understanding had been passed through the generations of those animals. The understanding that this human and those who traveled with her were not to be harmed. Whether this was because of a gray she-wolf healed with moss and herbs and strips torn from a lavender-scented blanket on a morning in November 1886, or whether it was something else entirely, was a question that Ada never tried to answer. Some things are better carried as mystery than resolved into explanation. Ada Crane died in the winter of 1949 at the age of 74 in the stone home she had carved from the mountain with her own hands 63 years earlier. She passed in her sleep. The fire had burned in the same pit for more than 6 decades. The walls still held the warmth of it, the slow, steady thermal memory of sandstone that has been heated and reheated through countless winters until the warmth has become part of the stone's own nature. Her students found her in the morning. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her face held an expression that the oldest among them recognized immediately, the expression of someone who has done what they set out to do and has found at the end that it was enough. They buried her beside her father in the canyon above the Bitterroot River, in the grave she had dug with blistered 9-year-old hands on a summer afternoon in 1884. Father and daughter side by side in the earth of the place where Thomas Crane had lived and died and passed everything he knew to the child who would carry it forward. Above the entrance to the cave, carved in letters that Ada had added sometime in the years after the Great Winter, is an inscription. Visitors have been photographing it for 100 years. They share it, they carry it home and find that it stays with them, surfacing at unexpected moments in quiet rooms, on sleepless nights, in conversations where someone is saying something true and the people around them would rather not hear it. The inscription reads, "The mountains told me. I told them. Now we all know. Thomas Crane, who had taught his daughter to listen when the whole world was busy not listening, who had spent a lifetime accumulating wisdom and given every piece of it away without reservation, who had died in a clearing above the Bitterroot River and been buried by the small, bleeding hands of the child he had spent 9 years preparing for exactly this. Thomas Crane would have recognized the truth in every carved letter, would have sat before that inscription on a cold morning and nodded once, slowly, the nod he saved for when his daughter saw the right thing. Because in the end, survival is not the whole of it. A person can survive alone. An animal can survive alone. But choosing to share what you know with the people who hurt you, choosing to open a door you built with bleeding hands for people who voted to send you into the dark, choosing to be something more than the cold that tried to kill you and the cruelty that tried to break you, that is not survival. That is something else. Something that lives in the space between mercy and justice, between anger and compassion, between the wound and the choice not to wound in return. Ada Crane lived in that space for 63 years. She carved a home in it the way she carved a home in stone, with patience, with the knowledge her father gave her, with hands that bled and healed and bled again, and kept working. And when the people who had cast her out came through the snow, broken by the very winter she had warned them about, she opened the door. She opened the door, and 89 people lived through that winter who should have died, and their children lived, and their children's children. And somewhere in Montana, on a cliff face that glows red gold in the afternoon light, a door still stands in a frame built by a girl who was 11 years old and alone, and carrying everything her father had ever taught her, and who chose when the moment came to give it all away.